No one noticed when Iris Hartwell pressed herself against the wooden wall of Murphy's General Store, but everyone noticed when they spoke about her like she was already gone. The cold Montana wind of 1867 cut through her thin dress and into her bones. But the wind was not the worst part. The voices inside the store hurt far more than the cold ever could. Sharp whispers floated through the dusty air and slipped through the open doorway. Each word landed on Iris like a stone. Henderson's voice rose above the others. It was loud, confident, and filled with the kind of cruelty that came easily to people who had never been alone. She said that girl brought nothing but trouble wherever she went. Iris closed her eyes. At 16 years old, she had already learned how to make herself smaller. She had spent most of her life trying to disappear so people would forget she was there. She had no family, no money, no protection, only a name written on a small scrap of paper that had once been pinned to the blanket wrapped around her tiny body when she had been left on the church steps. Please take care of Iris. No one truly had. Another woman inside the store spoke up. She said Iris had been fired from the Miller farm after a silver spoon went missing. The accusation still clung to her like mud. Iris's hands trembled where they rested against the rough wall. Not from guilt, from anger she had long ago learned never to show. The spoon had been found days later, exactly where she had said it would be. But no one apologized to girls like Iris. Once a story stuck to someone like her, it never let go. Mrs. Henderson continued speaking loudly, saying Iris would soon end up sleeping in the street. She said she could not imagine who would ever be foolish enough to trust that girl. The bell above the store door rang suddenly. The sound cut through the gossip like a knife. Heavy boots stepped onto the wooden floor inside the store. Iris opened her eyes. The man who walked in carried silence with him. Jacob Whitmore was tall and broad-shouldered. His movements were steady and calm, in a way that made the room feel smaller. His brown leather coat was worn, but well cared for. His face carried deep lines that did not belong to age alone. They were the marks of grief. Everyone in town knew his story. His wife had died 2 winters earlier. Since then, Jacob came to town only once each month. He bought his supplies, spoke only when necessary, and then returned to his ranch in the valley beyond Copper Creek. He lived alone now. Inside the store, he quietly gathered flour, coffee, and sugar. His hands moved slowly and carefully, as if he had spent years learning how easily things in life could break. When he reached for a heavy sack on the high shelf, his eyes lifted. They met Iris's. She expected him to look away the same way everyone else always did. But he didn't. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was no pity either. Only something quiet and understanding, like he recognized the feeling of being alone in a place where no one wanted you. Mrs. Henderson noticed the moment as well. She scoffed loudly and warned him not to let that girl fool him. She said Iris was trouble and always would be. Jacob's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. He simply paid for his supplies and lifted the bags into his arms. Then he turned toward Iris. The entire store went silent. Jacob spoke calmly and called her Miss. His voice was low but steady. He asked if he might speak with her outside. Iris felt her heart begin to pound so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. She hesitated before quietly asking if he truly meant her. She even pointed to her own chest. Jacob nodded once, yes. There was a hint of kindness in his eyes that she had never seen directed toward her before. Iris pushed herself away from the wall and stepped forward on unsteady legs. She could feel the stairs burning into her back as she walked past the store door and into the cold. Outside, the air felt cleaner, freer. Jacob set his supplies in the wagon, and then turned to face her. He spoke plainly. He said he had heard she was looking for work. Iris nodded quickly. Everyone in town knew she was desperate. She told him yes. She needed work badly. Jacob looked toward the distant mountains, where the tops were already dusted with early snow. Then he said he needed help on his ranch. The work would be honest and difficult, but he could offer a room, food, and fair pay. He also said he would ask no questions about her past. The words did not make sense to Iris at first. Men did not offer things like that to girls like her. She asked why. Her voice was small and unsure. Jacob looked back at the mountains again before answering. He said everyone deserved a chance, and it seemed she had not yet had hers. The wagon ride away from Copper Creek felt unreal to Iris. The town slowly disappeared behind them as the road opened into a wide valley that made her breath catch. Golden grass stretched across the land, like waves moving in slow motion. Tall mountains stood around the valley like quiet guardians. Jacob did not speak much during the ride, but when he did, his voice was gentle. He pointed out hawks circling high above the hills. He showed her deer tracks along the edge of the road and clouds forming over the peaks that meant weather would arrive soon. He told her he and his wife had built the ranch 8 years earlier. His wife had loved this valley. Iris could hear the love still living in his voice. It made her wonder what it must feel like to be cherished that way. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road. The house stood strong and warm against the wide sky. Smoke curled softly from the chimney. Behind the house stood a barn, a corral, and a small cabin tucked near a group of trees. Jacob stopped the wagon and pointed toward the cabin. He told her that place would be hers. Inside she would find a bed, a small stove, a table, and a water pump just outside the door. It would be her own space. Iris stepped inside slowly. The cabin was small but clean. A thick quilt lay folded neatly on the bed. On the windowsill rested a single purple wildflower in a small glass jar. Jacob stood quietly in the doorway. He explained that his wife had loved flowers. He thought Iris might like them too. Tears burned in Iris's eyes, but she forced them back down. Kindness felt unfamiliar and almost frightening. That evening, Jacob returned with supper, a bowl of warm stew, fresh bread, a glass of milk. He said the first day could feel overwhelming. After he left, Iris sat beside the window while she ate. Outside, the sky slowly filled with stars brighter than any she had ever seen. Her stomach felt full, but something else inside her felt full too. Hope. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen her. And as the mountains stood silent outside the cabin window, Iris felt something shift deep inside her heart. Maybe this place could be different. Maybe she could be different. She did not yet know how difficult the road ahead would become, but she knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. The rooster's crow split the darkness like a gunshot, and Iris Hartwell sat straight up in bed, with her heart racing. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the small cabin came back to her. The wooden walls, the quilt on the bed, the quiet valley outside the window. Pale morning light barely touched the sky. The mountains were only dark shapes against the horizon. Cold air slipped through the room, reminding her that ranch life did not wait for comfort. Iris quickly pulled on the sturdy clothes Jacob had left for her. The trousers still felt strange after years of wearing worn dresses, but they were warm and strong, meant for work. When she stepped outside, her breath rose into the air in white clouds. The valley smelled of hay, frost, and animals. Lantern light moved inside the barn. Jacob Whitmore was already working. Iris walked quickly toward the barn, her boots crunching against frozen ground. When she stepped inside, warmth and the quiet sounds of animals wrapped around her. Horses shifted inside their stalls. One of them snorted softly. Jacob moved between them with calm confidence. The lantern in his hand swung gently as he worked. He noticed her, but did not stop. He simply told her to grab a bucket because they would start with feed. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt that she belonged there. The work was harder than anything Iris had ever done. She carried heavy buckets of grain. She shoveled hay. She hauled water that splashed against her legs in the freezing air. Her hands ached. Her arms burned. Her back protested every movement. But Jacob showed her everything slowly and patiently. He explained cattle the way some people explained books. He said animals would always tell you what they needed if you paid attention. You just had to listen. Iris listened with everything she had. By midday, her muscles trembled with exhaustion. They sat beneath a tall cottonwood tree while the horses grazed nearby. Jacob handed her a tin cup of water. He watched the animals for a long moment before speaking. He told her she moved calmly around them, that animals trusted calm people. The words surprised her. No one had ever spoken about her that way before. She carried those words with her long after the sun went down that evening. Days slowly turned into weeks. Then, weeks became months. Winter arrived early in the valley. Snow covered the hills like a thick blanket. The wind carried a deep silence that seemed to settle over everything. Iris learned quickly. She learned to read the sky and know when storms were coming. She learned how to mend broken fence posts and repair leather straps. She learned how to guide cattle across frozen ground without spooking them. Her hands grew rough and strong. But the biggest change was not in her body. It was inside her heart. On the ranch, she was not a burden. She was not a rumor whispered in dark corners. She mattered. When Jacob and Iris rode into Copper Creek for supplies, the old feeling returned the moment the town came into view. Eyes followed them. Whispers floated through the streets. Miss Henderson stood near the entrance of Murphy's store once again. Her sharp eyes landed on Iris immediately. She spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. She said something about the rancher and his little arrangement. Iris kept her chin lifted as she tied Belle to the hitching post. But her stomach twisted with the familiar feeling of shame. Inside the store, the voices continued. People spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. They talked about what was proper and what was not. They said nothing good could come from a young girl living alone on a ranch with a widower. Jacob said nothing while he gathered supplies. But Iris noticed the tight line in his jaw. On the ride home, she finally spoke. Her voice was careful and soft. She told Jacob that people were talking about him because of her. Jacob shook his head slowly. He said people talked because they did not understand. What mattered was what they knew was true. His words were simple, but they carried weight. That night, they sat at the kitchen table with a lantern glowing softly between them. Account books were spread across the wood. Iris studied the numbers while Jacob explained how the ranch worked. As she watched the tired lines in his face, a quiet decision formed inside her heart. She would not let the town destroy the life they were building. She would work harder, stand taller, and give them no reason to doubt her place there. February brought a storm the valley would remember for years. The wind arrived first, screaming across the mountains like something alive. Then snow came crashing down. It slammed against the house and barn with a force that shook the walls. Iris stood inside her cabin, watching the storm rage outside. Then she saw the faint light of a lantern moving near the barn. Jacob. She threw on her coat and ran into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways. Snow whipped against her face so hard it burned her skin. Jacob's voice cut through the chaos. The north fence had broken. Cattle were scattering toward the canyon. Fear tightened around Iris's chest. But she did not hesitate. She shouted that she would take Belle and head east while he followed the northern herd. Jacob immediately shook his head. It was too dangerous. But Iris looked toward the dark hills where the cattle were running. If they waited, the animals would die. For a long moment they stared at each other through the roaring storm. Snow swirled around them like white smoke. Finally, Jacob nodded. The night became a blur of wind and snow. Iris pushed Belle forward through the storm. The horse fought the wind but kept moving. She found small groups of cattle huddled together in fear. Using her voice and the steady strength of the horse beneath her, she guided them slowly back toward the ranch. Hours passed. Her hands were numb. Her face burned from the cold. Near the canyon's edge, she felt panic rising in her chest. The wind howled so loudly she could barely hear herself breathe. The dark drop of the canyon opened before them, like a mouth waiting to swallow the herd. Iris rode Belle between the cattle and the edge. She trusted the horse completely. She spoke softly to the animals, her voice shaking but steady enough to guide them. Slowly the herd turned. Slowly they moved away from the canyon. When the first gray light of dawn finally touched the sky, every animal stood safe within the ranch fences. Jacob rode toward her through the drifting snow. He climbed down quickly and helped her slide from the saddle. His hands were steady as he held her arms, but his eyes held something she had never seen there before. Respect, and something deeper. He told her she had saved them. Iris shook her head. She said they had saved them. Later that morning, they sat near the fire inside the ranch house. Their frozen hands slowly warmed around tin cups of coffee. The storm still roared outside, but the house felt quiet and safe. Jacob looked at her across the fire. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. He told her something he had not realized until that night. He had believed he was giving her a chance, but she had given one to him. She had reminded him how to live again. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fire crackled between them. Jacob stood slowly. Then he stepped forward. Iris watched him with wide eyes as he reached for her. His arms wrapped around her gently. For a single heartbeat, Iris froze. No one had ever held her like that before. Not once in her entire life. Then warmth spread through her chest. Safety. Acceptance. Her body relaxed without permission. She leaned into the quiet strength of his arms. For the first time in her life, Iris Hartwell felt what a real embrace was supposed to feel like. When they finally stepped apart, neither of them spoke. But everything between them had changed. The storm outside slowly faded. Yet inside the small ranch house, something powerful had begun. That night, Iris lay awake in her cabin staring at the wooden ceiling. Her heart felt full, and frightened at the same time. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew the road ahead would test them both, and the quiet valley that had given her a home was about to demand more courage than either of them expected. Spring came to the valley slowly, like the land itself was afraid to hope too soon. The heavy snow that had covered the hills for months began to melt. Thin streams of water ran down the slopes and across the fields. The frozen ground softened, and small patches of green grass pushed their way toward the sun. The air carried the fresh smell of earth waking up. Iris Hartwell felt the change inside herself, too. She moved across the ranch with confidence now. Her shoulders stood straight, and her voice carried strength instead of hesitation. The work beside Jacob Whitmore had become a rhythm that felt natural. They woke before the sun. They worked through long days. They shared quiet meals at night. The valley had slowly shaped them into something steady and strong. Neither of them spoke about the night of the storm. They did not need to. The way Jacob looked at Iris had changed. Warmth now lived in his eyes where distance once had been, and the way Iris stood beside him carried trust instead of fear. They worked side by side, building something neither of them had known they were missing. Then trouble arrived. It came riding in from the east on a bright morning when the sky was clear and the valley seemed peaceful. 3 riders appeared near the far edge of the ranch. Their horses were tall and well-fed. Their coats were clean and expensive, too fine for the rough Montana trails. Jacob noticed them first. He set down the tool in his hand and watched the riders approach. Iris felt an uneasy feeling settle deep in her stomach. The man in front stepped down from his horse with stiff confidence. His eyes were cold and calculating. He introduced himself as Martin Fitzgerald. His smile never reached his eyes. He explained that Catherine Whitmore had been his sister. The name struck the air like thunder. Jacob went completely still. Atherian had been Jacob's wife. The second man stepped forward. He carried a leather case and wore a dark coat that marked him clearly as a lawyer. His voice was smooth and practiced. He spoke about legal concerns regarding Catherine's inheritance. He said there were questions about how the ranch had been managed since her death. Then, Martin Fitzgerald turned his gaze toward Iris. His eyes held open dislike. He pointed at her as if she were nothing more than a stain on the land. He said the situation was simple. Either the girl left the ranch immediately, or they would challenge Jacob's right to keep the property. The lawyer explained calmly that such a scandal could be enough to take the ranch away completely. They gave Jacob 48 hours. Then they mounted their horses and rode away across the valley. Silence followed them. That night, the ranch house felt heavy with quiet. Jacob sat at the table, staring down at the papers the lawyer had left behind. The lantern light cast long shadows across his tired face. Iris sat alone inside her small cabin. The quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She stared at it for a long time. Memories filled her mind. Every place she had been pushed away from. Every door that had closed in her face. Every voice that had said she did not belong. Before the sun rose the next morning, Iris made her decision. She quietly packed the few things she owned. If she left now, Jacob might still be able to save the ranch. The valley would survive without her. Jacob would survive without her. She stepped outside just as the first light touched the mountains. But Jacob was already there. He stood beside the wagon watching her. He told her to stop. Iris tried to explain that she could not be the reason he lost everything he had built. Her voice trembled, but her decision felt clear. Jacob's answer came quickly. His voice broke slightly as he spoke. He told her the ranch was not worth keeping if it meant losing her. He said they would face whatever came together. 2 days later, the courthouse in Copper Creek filled with more people than it had ever seen before. Word had spread quickly across the valley. Inside the courtroom, whispers moved through the crowd like restless wind. Iris walked beside Jacob. She wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself during the winter months. Her hands trembled slightly, but her steps remained steady. The hearing began with the lawyer speaking for Martin Fitzgerald. He described Iris as a scandal. He suggested that Jacob had allowed an improper arrangement on his land. He spoke about appearances and community standards. Then Jacob stood. The room slowly quieted. His voice was calm and steady. He did not speak with anger. He spoke about truth. He explained that Iris worked the ranch beside him every day. She earned her place through honest labor and strength. He spoke about respect, about partnership, about the kind of love that builds people up instead of tearing them down. His words filled the room with a quiet power. Then something unexpected happened. A voice rose from the back of the courtroom. It belonged to the store owner from Murphy's General Store. He stepped forward and spoke about the hard work he had seen Iris do. Then the town blacksmith spoke. Then 2 neighboring ranchers. One after another, they stood and shared what they had witnessed with their own eyes. They spoke about Iris's strength, her honesty, her character, They said they believed what they had seen more than what they had heard. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Then a woman slowly stepped forward from the crowd. She held something small in her hands. Her voice trembled as she introduced herself. Her name was Beth Morrison. She said she was Iris Hartwell's sister. The room fell into complete silence. Iris stared at the woman in shock. Beth stepped closer and placed a small wooden horse into Iris's shaking hands. The moment Iris touched it, something deep inside her stirred. A memory. A song softly hummed long ago. A feeling of warmth and safety she had never fully remembered. Beth explained that years earlier, their struggling family had been forced to separate the children. Iris had been left at the church steps, in the desperate hope someone would give her a better life. Tears filled Iris's eyes as the truth finally unfolded. The judge listened carefully to every voice in the room. When he finally spoke, his decision was clear. Jacob Whitmore would keep his ranch. The accusations carried no weight, and the partnership between Jacob and Iris was recognized as honest and lawful. Outside the courthouse, the wide Montana sky stretched above them. Iris felt something inside her finally settle. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting to survive. She was choosing to live. She was choosing love. The wedding took place weeks later in the valley that had changed both of their lives. The ceremony was simple. Friends stood nearby. Mountains watched quietly from every side. The wind carried their promises across the tall grass. Iris stood tall beside Jacob, no longer hiding, no longer trying to disappear. Jacob held her hand with quiet pride. Years passed. The ranch slowly grew stronger. But something else grew even more important. Girls with nowhere else to go began arriving at the ranch. Girls who had been abandoned. Girls who had been blamed for things they had not done. They found work there. They found shelter. They found dignity. Second chances took root across the valley like wildflowers. Laughter slowly returned to the land. One quiet evening, many years later, Iris stood on the porch beside Jacob as the sun dipped behind the mountains. His arm rested gently around her shoulders. The golden light stretched across the valley they had built together. Long ago, she had pressed herself against walls, trying to disappear from the world. Now she stood in her own valley, seen, chosen, loved. Iris Hartwell had once believed love meant being rescued, but she had learned something far deeper. Love was not about being saved. Love was about being seen. And in the quiet strength of a widower's embrace, Iris Hartwell had finally learned what it truly meant to belong.